United States. With that, Mr. President, I move Senate Memorial 17-002 and ask that it be read at length.
Mr. Carpenter.
Senate Memorial 2 by Senators Hill and Garcia concerning memorializing Congress to hold the United States Department of Veterans Affairs accountable. Whereas Colorado is home to more than 400,000 veterans, and whereas the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, spent more than $3.5 billion on health care and benefits for Colorado veterans in 2015. And whereas 2 years ago, Congress and the VA implemented a $16 billion program to drastically decrease the amount of time veterans wait for health care, yet today, veterans wait longer than ever to see a provider. And whereas the VA is having trouble attracting doctors, a recent survey showed that only 1.9 to 2.5% of physicians found government or military employment a desirable practice setting. And whereas the shortage of providers and subsequent lack of care is reflected in the fact that the rate of suicide is 21% higher for veterans and has increased by 32% since 2001. And whereas, on average, 20 veterans commit suicide every day. And whereas, until recently, the VA was treating chronic pain almost exclusively with opioids, resulting in an addiction and fatal overdose rate among veterans that is almost double the national average. And whereas all America's veterans have unique needs, and the VA should refocus its work and prioritize veterans with service-connected disabilities and specialized needs. And whereas the VA has repeatedly come under fire from veterans groups and lawmakers for its failure to punish corrupt employees and address the system-wide failure that has resulted in false, misleading wait times and serious medical care issues. And whereas two measures to hold the VA accountable for its egregious lack of service to and neglect of the nation's veterans passed unanimously out of the United States House of Representatives but remain stalled in the Senate. And whereas Congress must act to hold all VA employees responsible, particularly those in leadership roles. And whereas documented cases of whistleblower retaliation continue to plague the VA, exposing the harassment and attempted bribery of former VA employees who have brought the department's failures to light. And whereas the VA needs much stronger whistleblower protections, as ideas for system-wide change and reform need to come from within, and those who expose abuse and waste should be protected. And whereas, as the demographics of America's veterans rapidly change, their system of care needs to change as well to ensure high-quality, consistent health care and benefits for all veterans. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Senate of the 71st General Assembly of the State of Colorado that we, the members of the Senate, in recognition of the need to hold the United States Department of Veterans Affairs accountable for the health care of our nation's veterans, declare that the United States Congress must pass reforms that prioritize our country's servicemen and women over bureaucracy to ensure that those who risk everything for our country receive the best care possible. Be it further resolved that copies of this memorial be sent to David Shulkin, United States Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Major General Michael A. Lowe, Adjutant General of Colorado, members of the United States House Committee on Veterans Affairs, members of the United States Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, and the members of Colorado's congressional delegation.
Senator Hill. Senator Garcia, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, you can please be seated. Being the senator from Pueblo, I want to bring your attention to Pueblo being the home of the heroes, along with the 4 Congressional Medal of Honor recipients that our community is known for. We also are a community that's vibrant in the sense of all the service members that have joined in serving in the armed forces. As a Marine veteran who served in Iraq as a mortuary affairs specialist in 2003, it gives me great pride and honor to join my colleague here in this resolution urging Congress to hold the United States Department of Veterans Affairs accountable. And my story is not unique in the sense that Colorado is home to 400,000 veterans, and this memorial is an important to our veterans community and how we are approaching the health care crisis that our veterans are experiencing every single day in not only this state, but this country. When they come home from their military service and are in the process of transitioning to civilian life, it's something that they should not be experiencing. One of the approaches that we need to combat in this, one thing that we could be doing is urging the Department of Veterans Affairs to be held accountable and for them to seek reform from within, especially for those who have served this great nation. Sadly, 20 veterans a day commit suicide. Many veterans are struggling with addiction from the medications that are being prescribed to them for pain management. More and more veterans are seeing longer and longer wait times to see a medical professional or mental health services, or especially in rural Colorado, they can't even be able to see those services. And the shortage that we're seeing for attracting and retaining healthcare professionals is growing. The list of the challenges for the VA system goes on, and the VA has repeatedly come under fire from veterans organizations to veterans, citizens, lawmakers. It's important that this is not the first time, nor do I think it will be the last time that we call out the VA for some of their inactions, but I think it's important that we remind them to live up to their motto. We must prioritize our country's servicemen and women over bureaucracy and ensure that those who are willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice are treated with the utmost respect. And finally, Mr. President, I would add that I will close with this by reminding us of the VA. There are two plaques that flank the headquarters of the Department of Veterans Affairs office there in Washington, D.C. And these words are shared there. We share this responsibility, and these are words from President Abraham Lincoln. It says, quote, "To care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow, and for his orphan."
Senator Hill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, we worked hard in crafting this memorial, and there's some important statistics in here that I want to point out as you're talking to veterans within your communities, your town halls. As these issues come up, I want you to know that right now this has not been a challenge of money. In Colorado, we estimate we spend about $3.5 billion. Now, this is federal money. This is not part of our budget. $3.5 billion on health care and benefits for Colorado veterans. That number is from 2015. Several years ago, we implemented a $16 billion program to drastically decrease the amount of times veterans have to wait for health care, and yet they wait longer than ever to see a provider right now. We all know the statistic about 20 veterans committing suicide every day, the opioid addiction and abuse challenges, and there are several measures out there. This is not something that's beyond, these aren't a whole set of new ideas. Two measures have literally passed unanimously out of the U.S. House. It's time to get those going in the Senate. And maybe the one, if you ask what can be done about this, because many times people ask me as a veteran, someone who studied these issues, Owen, what can we do about this? I say it's time for us to refocus our attention on those men and women who have specific service-related challenges resulting from their time in service. That's the role, that's the task of the VA going forward, and recognizing we have amazing hospitals, amazing doctors, and other resources here in Colorado for some of the more routine things. We need to focus on treating our service members with service-related injuries and disabilities. I think that needs to be our focus going forward. It's a growing trend nationally that we talk about. So when folks ask, and we have veterans talk to you about this, know that there are solutions out there, and those solutions require us to renew our focus on the veterans and what they've given them. And Mr. President, I'll just finish with a reminder. At the Air Force Academy, we did have to memorize this quote, and I still remember it today, where John Stuart Mills says, "War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling that thinks that nothing is worth war is much worse. As the soldier has nothing for which he is willing to fight, nothing which is more important than his own personal safety, is a miserable creature and has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by the exertions of better men," and I'll add, and women, than himself. And we live in that today. We have examples of those who are the better men and women who make us and keep us free. And it is our moral duty to make sure that as they come back, as they transition back into civilian life, that we have their back, that we will provide and protect and honor their service. And this memorial, Mr. President and colleagues, is just another one of the ways we can do that.
Senator Todd.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I rise in support of Senate Memorial 002. I am so appreciative of the two gentlemen, my fellow senators, who have served, who've stepped up and served our nation. I thank you for bringing this memorial today. Being a resident of Aurora, I can't help but look at one of the greatest embarrassments, I think, of the VA, and that is the VA hospital that has been under the building process for such a long time. I can remember going to hearings at Fitzsimmons when Wayne Allard and Ken Salazar were our senators, and listening to them fight for and continuing to advocate for, bringing in veterans after veterans after veteran groups to the forefront to have those discussions about how do we keep moving this forward. In the 13 years I've been down here, there have been at least 6, if I'm counting right, secretaries of the Department of Veterans Affairs. That shows me it's not a Democrat, it's not a Republican issue. It is an issue of inefficiency. It is an issue of not getting the job done. If you've not visited the VA hospital over on 9th and Colorado in that vicinity, that hospital is as old as I am. It was built, I believe, the same year I was built. And when we visited, some of the patients, and they were sharing rooms, and the facility was clean, and they were doing as well as they could, but they had things set up in the hall to try to deal with and use for treatment centers for the patients. These are our veterans who have served our country and have served our country well. I'm proud of the fact that at Fitzsimmons Hospital, you can still go and visit and see where Dwight Eisenhower was treated when he had his heart attack. It's been memorialized. It's a great facility to go and visit. That was then, this is now, and when the VA hospital actually opens, it will be under capacity. We will not be able to even host and hold all of the needs that we have because it's a regional hospital. So what is being brought forward in terms of the treatment of our veterans is real. It is absolutely essential that we do rise up, that we do not look away, but that we do speak up and that we do hold the VA accountable. So again, I thank you both for your service as well as bringing the memorial today. Thank you very much.
Senator Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, colleagues, for spending some time this morning on this important issue. From the incredibly tragic rising rate of suicide among our vet population to the story after story that we hear of sub-quality health care, and to the frustrations of rural vets trying to access health care, and they just get faced with bureaucracy after bureaucracy, even though they're trying to access even the simplest of care. We know these problems. I also know the problems from getting calls from constituents that have finally got where they have nowhere else to turn because they're so frustrated by the process of trying to access health care. I also know it from watching my grandfather, who is a career Army vet, and in his final years when he needed increased care, the situation that he found when he visited VA hospitals. All of these stories are unacceptable. And if we can identify the problems, then it would seem that a solution shouldn't be far behind, but we just continue to identify more problems and talk about issues. There have been suggestions of how to solve these problems, but there seems to be inaction. We've made a promise, and we must do better. And I just really want to thank the sponsors for bringing forward this resolution that has important and strong language that was thoughtful. And so thank you for doing that today.
Is there any further discussion? Senator Marble?
Thank you, Mr. President. This really hits home to my family, and I just want to relay to you an incident that happened not too long ago where my son ended up with a medical emergency in a VA hospital. He couldn't hardly walk and barely made it in, sat around after they looked at him for 8 hours, 8 hours, in a hallway with no assistance. And then when they finally, oh, you're still here. Well, where the heck is he going to go? He can't walk. They said finally, you know, we can't treat you. You're going to have to take yourself to the public hospital. So he did, where he sat for 4 days and had IVs with antibiotics the VA wouldn't help him with and wouldn't even tell him in a decent amount of time as the infection began to grow worse and worse over those 8 hours. Never gave him any painkillers, never gave him anything to help treat because they didn't know what it was. But they didn't have the decency to tell him right away. This happens all the time. And yes, I do agree with the other senator who came up and said that she also receives complaints from her constituents. So do I. I don't know any of us who don't. And this couldn't be better written. With everything that we have, these are the sons and daughters of America, and we should treat them as such. And you know what? Our VA hospitals are an abomination to what has been given by our military personnel. And I am so in favor of this and cannot thank the sponsors enough.
Senator Crowder.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also stand in support of SM17-002. You know, the part of the problem we have with, well, there's been a few things up here that have been said that I tend to disagree with about the VA hospital. The VA hospital in itself is exactly what we need. It's not an abomination to the state. The problem was a bureaucratic process to get us to that hospital was the problem. So I do not think we should cross over on exactly what, you know, we should be grateful for that VA hospital, but you need to be aware in the state of Colorado there's only one VA hospital, unless they got one in Grand Junction, I'm not sure. But the reality is, most of rural Colorado, we rely on clinics. You know, it is a complex problem. You know, the last data I seen on the VA was there were 7,000 doctors short in the United States, which does put a lot of burden on especially our clinics. That's why we have moved toward the idea of using nurse practitioners where we can or other providers. But the reality is there's a lot of, on any emergency, unless you have to be qualified. Just because you're a veteran, that doesn't mean that you have access to VA hospital. The VA hospital, you know, you have to sign up. There's about 7 different layers or levels, and even any veteran anywhere, if there's a medical emergency, you automatically go to the nearest hospital. That may or may not be a VA hospital, but the problem, the biggest problem with the VA too, or another large problem, it's a political football. There's not enough money that you can throw at this to fix the problem. You know, it's not about, it's about getting the right personnel in place, hire the doctors. I think even this resolution indicates the low difference in what people think of being a doctor in the VA system. Because it is, you have to realize what it's like to be a doctor in the VA. Even in our clinics, the phones ring continuously. It is very, you know, it's hard work for a doctor in a VA clinic and or hospital. You know, we have, I think the biggest thing we can do is somewhat, you know, we need to figure a way to, and there is a program in the VA that you can go to a civilian hospital and the VA will pay for it, but you have to go through a contractor, and this has always been the problem. you know, there's one contract in the United States, and they're split between in the Mississippi, that dictates where, if that VA will cover the cost of the veterans in a private hospital. And that's always been the problem. It's more so with the contractor. Where I fault Washington is not being able to take control of this contract, to say, okay, if your needs are to be met at a civilian hospital, you go there. And you know, then you got to realize the VA only pays Medicare rate, so that creates another problem. But there's a lot of issues, and to be honest, we've made a lot of advances on this, but it continues to be a political football that will, you know, create situations like we've seen here in Denver, where you had $1 billion price tag. You know, but the hospital itself is very much needed, but the bureaucracy to get to that point is what needs to be looked at. So I look very much forward. I think that the new VA hospital is opening this coming year, and we're very much looking forward to it. You know, the existing VA in Colorado has outlived its usefulness. And I will tell you one brief story. You know, I was, just prior to this session starting, I made an appointment with the VA in Alamosa, and I just got a call this week that's saying, well, we have to change your appointment. So, you know, in November, I made the appointment for the end of session, or the week of May 9th. Now that same appointment is turned into July. So it does take a long time to, you know, but the reality is we always have that civilian component there that we need to rely on in an emergency. But anyway, I do support the resolution. It will be an ongoing fight, and I'm glad to see I have two military advocates here, albeit a Marine and an Air Force guy. But other than that, thank you very much.
Is there any further discussion? Motion before the body is the adoption of Senate Memorial 2. Are there any no votes? With a vote of 35 ayes, 0 noes, 0 absent, 0 excused, Senate Memorial 2 is adopted. Senator Hill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ask for use of the current roll call as co-sponsors.
Without objection, the current roll call will be added as co-sponsor. Senator Hill.
Thanks again, Mr. President. I request a moment of personal privilege to introduce a couple of veterans who are really bringing light to this issue, as well as helping folks in the transition process make sure they don't fall through the bureaucracy.
Granted.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I wonder if we might just acknowledge and recognize, if you'll stand up when I introduce you and just say hello. Lexi Wagnold is a major in the U.S. Army, age 64, Delta Attack Longbow helicopter pilot, operations officer in the U.S. Army Reserve, and is now the state administrator of Team Rubicon, which is this neat organization, nonprofit combining veterans, first responders, and civilians to help communities on their worst days. Garrett Prater, recently honorably discharged in the U.S. Navy, flew the T-6B Texan and was a division officer for an intel unit, is actually now looking for full-time employment in supply chain operations management. Sean Hansen, again, recently honorably discharged from the U.S. Navy, is EOD guy, explosive ordnance disposal, right? This is the guy disarming those IEDs in Iraq. He hosts Guard the Guardians, is a podcast with one main mission: helping veterans, active military, first responders, and their families live better lives. Dustin Kissling, Navy SEAL, recently honorably discharged, operations in support of OEF, Operation Enduring Freedom. And now is project management of a startup company, an avid outdoorsman, and a backcountry skier. And colleagues, especially I want to highlight Rex Laceby here. USMC, we won't hold that against him. Prior enlisted Marine officer. Guys, Rex, an infantry Marine, force recon officer, and he's really on the forefront of this challenge in the education world. He works at CU Boulder, helping the veterans in transition, and the vice president of the Colorado Advisory Council on Military Education. So many of our veterans colleagues, when they come back, they've got a very generous GI Bill. the education sphere is the transition point for so many of our veterans these days. And so there's this intersection between Veterans Affairs and taking care of our veterans and our education system. And Rex gave up many other options to say this is where he can continue the fight with his brothers and sisters in arms by taking really just I don't want to say it's entry level because it's so important, but take an entry level salary to go and focus on this at CU, helping our veterans as they transition out to become now productive members of our society. Thank you, Mr. President and colleagues, for your attention this morning.
Senator Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I request a moment of personal privilege.
Granted.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to start off by thanking my colleague from the branch of service who shall not be named. But I would like to thank him for his commitment for fighting for veterans and the service that he's given to this country. I'd also like to recognize two who join us from Southern Colorado, Sean Gibson from the Veterans Upward Bound program at Public Community College, and Jacobo Varela from the Director of Veterans Upward Bound at CSU Pueblo. Thank you so much for joining us.